October 1951. Concealed by heavy fog, men of the 3rd Battalion Royal Australian Regiment make their way through rugged countryside towards Hill 317. Called Maryang San, this wasn't just any ordinary hill. This was a 200-meter nightmare of steep, rocky terrain leading to a summit of ridges with well-defended enemy positions. The Chinese forces, 7 times the number of the Australians, held the high ground of the hill, dug in extremely well. Earlier attempts were made by the US forces to cross the valley and take the hill. 2 times they tried. 2 times the communist forces pushed them back with heavy losses. Now it was Australia's turn. Drawing on their experience from New Guinea during the Second World War, the battle for Maryang San would become known as the most defining engagement by Australian forces during the entire Korean War. And yet, at the same time, it was also one of the most terrible moments of the war for the Australians. So why was this battle so important to the UN efforts in Korea? And what happened almost immediately afterwards that made this one of the most terrible days for the men of 3RAR? To answer this, we must first go back to why Australian troops were in Korea in the first place. After World War II ended in 1945, Korea, which had been controlled by Japan for 35 years, was split into 2 parts along the 38th parallel by the Soviet Union and the United States. They hoped to reunite Korea someday, but disagreements led each side to set up its own government in 1948. In the north, Kim Il-sung became the leader, and in the south, Syngman Rhee took charge. Both leaders claimed they were the rightful rulers of all of Korea, and small fights broke out between them. On June 25, 1950, North Korea's army, trained and equipped by the Soviet Union, invaded South Korea. This bold attempt to unite the country under communist rule began the Korean War. In defense of freedom, the United Nations, led by the United States, answered the call for help, and Australia was among the first nations to rise to the occasion only 5 days after the war started. This was no ordinary conflict. It was one of the early and defining battles of the Cold War, where democracy faced the growing threat of communism. For Australia, this moment was a proud chapter in their nation's history, as it marked the first time since World War II that they stepped onto the world stage to defend peace and democracy. Australia's involvement in the Korean War demonstrated its unwavering loyalty to the United Nations and its deep alliance with the United States. It showed the world that they were ready to stand up for what is right, no matter the cost. Australia's response was swift and decisive. Over 17,000 brave Australian soldiers, sailors, and airmen answered the call to serve, fighting side by side with our allies under the UN banner. At first, things looked bad for South Korea and its friends. They were pushed back to a small area called the Pusan Perimeter. But in September 1950, UN forces made a daring landing at a place called Incheon. This move cut off the North Korean army's supplies and helped turn the tide of the war. The UN forces then pushed into North Korea and advanced toward the Yalu River, which is the border with China. In October 1950, China entered the war by sending its army across the Yalu River to help North Korea. The UN forces had to retreat, and the fighting went back and forth. The capital city, Seoul, was captured and recaptured several times. Eventually, both sides ended up near the 38th parallel again, where they had started. The war became a tough stalemate, with neither side gaining much ground. Australian forces played a vital role in ground, air, and naval operations, and their courage and dedication were evident in every battle. Among these, the Battle of Maryang San stands out as a shining moment in Australian military history. As the Korean War entered its tough second year, the landscape itself became a big challenge. The area around Maryang San, called Hill 317, was full of steep peaks and deep valleys. While the autumn colours made it look beautiful, it was actually a dangerous battlefield. The steep slopes made climbing hard, and the narrow ridges offered little protection from enemy fire. Cold winds and morning fog made it even harder to see and move, making the situation more difficult. The Chinese forces had turned Maryang San into a strong defensive position. They dug trenches and bunkers into the rocky hills, connected by tunnels so they could move without being seen. Barbed wire blocked the way, and hidden mines lay under the fallen leaves. Camouflaged machine guns and artillery covered every possible path. These defenses were not only physical but also mentally challenging, showing how determined the Chinese soldiers were to hold their ground. For the Australian troops, this was a tough challenge. The 3rd Battalion Royal Australian Regiment, consisting of 700 to 800 men, had to climb uphill while fighting a well-defended enemy. The soldiers struggled to carry heavy gear up the rough terrain. Communication was difficult, and because they were high in the mountains, getting help or evacuating wounded soldiers would be slow and risky. Despite these difficulties, the Australians prepared carefully, determined to succeed. Leading the Australian forces was Lieutenant Colonel Frank Hassett, known for his smart tactics and strong dedication to his soldiers. He was respected as both a leader and a soldier, approachable but firm, with a sharp understanding of warfare. Key officers like Lieutenant Colonel Bruce Ferguson helped plan the attack, creating a strong sense of teamwork and purpose among the troops. On the other side were the Chinese People's Volunteer Army, 5,000 experienced soldiers who had fought many battles against the United Nations forces. They were led by capable commanders who knew the importance of Maryang San and were ready to defend it fiercely. The Chinese soldiers were 7 times more than the Australians and knew the terrain well, using it to their advantage. Maryang San was more than just a tall hill. At 200 meters, it offered a clear view of the surrounding valleys and ridges. Controlling the top meant having power over key supply routes and watching enemy movements from a distance. For the United Nations Command, capturing Maryang San was important for breaking the stalemate at the front lines. Holding the hill would disrupt the Chinese defenses and give the UN forces a key position for future operations. It wasn't just about taking land, it was about gaining an advantage that could change the course of the war. The battle for Maryang San represented the larger fight between the two sides, driven by tactical goals and the will to win. With this challenging hill as the backdrop, the stage was set for a battle that would push soldiers to their limits of bravery and endurance. The Australian forces were ready to make history, showcasing one more time their determination and skill in the face of tough odds. On the morning of October 3rd, 1951, Australian soldiers prepared at the foot of Maryang San. They had a plan that needed both bravery and clever thinking. The land ahead was tough, a maze of steep hills and hidden enemy forts manned by determined foes. Lieutenant Colonel Frank Hassett had crafted a smart strategy that relied on perfect teamwork between artillery and foot soldiers, with precise timing at its core. They planned the operation carefully to surprise the enemy and use the Australians' strengths. It would start with heavy artillery fire, aimed not just at causing damage, but at slowly weakening the Chinese defenses. This would disrupt enemy lines, destroy key forts, and open paths for the infantry to move forward. The infantry units were to move in coordinated waves. Each group had specific goals along the complex network of hills and valleys. Communication was critical. Frontline observers sent real-time information to adjust artillery fire, ensuring shells landed just ahead of the advancing soldiers. This required exact timing to avoid friendly fire and to keep the enemy under pressure, leaving them no time to regroup. Australian artillery units showed great skill in helping the infantry. Instead of random shelling, they aimed carefully at enemy bunkers, machine gun nests, and supply lines. This approach avoided unnecessary destruction and kept the terrain usable for their own troops. Jim Hughes, a platoon commander during the battle, later said, "The fog was so thick as the battalion made its way along the Imjin River that every man held onto the bayonet scabbard of the man in front of him." As the infantry began their climb, they faced unexpected resistance. The Chinese had hidden positions and used tactics to lure the Australians into traps. The difficult terrain made things worse, with narrow paths forcing soldiers to go single file, making them easy targets. Colonel Peter Scott, who was an intelligence officer at the time, recalled, "It was very, very hilly and very, very rough, with rocks and boulders and lots of trees and undergrowth, so it wasn't a picnic by any means. It was very, very difficult, and of course the soldiers, they were running up these hills with their bayonets fixed and throwing grenades." The Australian infantry showed remarkable bravery as they climbed under constant enemy fire. They moved with determination, using whatever cover they could find from rocks and sparse bushes. They carried heavy packs, weapons and ammo, but the weight of their gear was nothing compared to the importance of their mission. Smart tactics played a crucial role. Small units used hand signals to communicate silently, coordinated grenade throws to clear trenches, and used bayonets in close combat when ammo ran low. They adapted to changing situations with discipline and clever ideas. The coordination between the artillery and infantry was key to the operation's success. Artillery units adjusted their fire based on the infantry's movements, providing a moving shield of explosions that kept the enemy off balance. This required flawless communication and trust between the units. Colonel Peter Scott further explained the importance of artillery support during the operation. We had a whole division of artillery support so that we could concentrate it, and on one occasion we had the whole divisional artillery firing in, just in front of the battalion on top of the Hinge and Sierra, and then of course the Chinese reacted in about the same sort of strength with artillery fire and mortars. Amid strategic moves and tactical decisions, individual acts of heroism stood out. Major Basil Hardiman, for example, led D Company, which was down to just 72 men out of the usual 140. Despite being outnumbered and facing heavy enemy fire, Hardiman continued to lead his men through the assault. Even after being wounded by a Chinese machine gun, he stayed in the fight, helping his company push forward and capture key enemy positions until he was eventually relieved. Reflecting on his actions, Hardiman said, "In attack, you use entirely different muscles to defense." On October 8th, after 5 tough days of continuous fighting, the Australian troops finally claimed victory at the top of Maryang San. Their courage, discipline, and determination helped them overcome the steep, rocky landscape and the strong resistance from the Chinese forces. The last push to take the peak came after the enemy's defences fell apart under a series of artillery attacks and infantry assaults. Even though they were outnumbered and outgunned, the Australians outsmarted their enemy, forcing the Chinese soldiers to retreat, leaving behind a hard-won victory. For the tired Australian soldiers, reaching the top of Maryang San brought a sense of relief and pride. They not only captured an important strategic position, but also made a significant mark in their country's military history. Robert O'Neill, the official historian of the Korean War, described the battle as the greatest single feat of the Australian Army during the Korean War. The victory had come at a high cost, with 20 Australians killed and 89 wounded. But it was what happened next that dealt a terrible blow to the morale of the men that fought and died for the strategically important Hill 317. Sadly, after the Australians were withdrawn and British troops had taken over, by the 5th of November, Maryang San was recaptured by the Chinese. The tactically important ground remained in the hands of Chinese forces for the rest of the war. However, the capture of Maryang San had demonstrated Australia's strong military capability and their commitment to defending freedom and democracy in a new post-World War II era. The bravery of the Australian forces at Maryang San did not go unnoticed. Lieutenant Colonel Frank Hassett, whose smart tactics led the Australians to victory, was awarded the Distinguished Service Order for his leadership. Several other soldiers, including Major Basil Hardiman, were also recognised for their courage. The Battle of Maryang San is still considered one of Australia's greatest military achievements. It is remembered as an example of courage, resilience, and tactical skill. The legacy of this battle lives on, not just in military history, but in the hearts of the soldiers who fought there and the nation that honours their sacrifice. Most eloquently described by Warrant Officer Arthur Stanley as one of the best planned operations, commanded by experts, fought with outstanding bravery by all who took part, in some of the worst country in the world, with victory at the end. Today, it stands as a symbol of Australia's commitment to its allies and its dedication to defending peace and freedom wherever it is challenged. Thank you for joining us on this journey through one of Australia's greatest military engagements. If you found this story inspiring, please like, subscribe and share to help keep these incredible stories alive. Tap the screen to see more videos like this. Until next time, thank you for watching.